I used to think the woods had moods, quiet ones you could listen to if you stayed still long enough. When the air thickened, when the needles didn't sway though the wind should have been moving them, that was when I knew to keep my voice low. It wasn't superstition, it was respect. You learn that working these forests long enough, the trees hear you, and some of them remember. I've been a ranger for 22 years, stationed along the northern stretch of the Cascade Range in Washington state. My cabin sits on a sloping ridge above a dense valley where the pines grow close enough to choke the light out. Locals call it Whisper Hollow, though you won't find that name on any official map. It's the kind of place that looks peaceful in daylight, but every ranger who's pulled a night shift there knows better. The radio barely works in the hollow. GPS drifts like a drunk compass. Sometimes hikers go missing for a few hours, wandering in circles until the morning comes. We used to laugh about it. Forest hypnosis, we called it. But the longer I worked here, the less I laughed. I was assigned to this region after a series of odd reports. Animal carcasses arranged in lines, faint drumming heard in the distance at night, and, most unsettling, footprints too large to belong to any known creature in the area. The locals had their own explanations. Forest spirits, or the tall ones who come down from the ridges when the mist rolls in. I'd heard stories like that since childhood, always told in the same low, reverent tone that made you feel you were overhearing something sacred or forbidden. When I first took the job, I was proud of my rationality. A ranger's duty is to protect, to remain calm, to know the land better than anyone else. But pride is a fragile thing out here. The forest doesn't reward certainty, it punishes it. The first time I heard the knocking, it was just after midnight in early autumn. I was finishing a report about an injured elk when a steady, deliberate sound came from the north wall of my cabin. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. It wasn't the scurrying of an animal, not the restless shifting of branches. It was rhythmic, human. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, expecting to find one of the volunteer trainees playing a prank. The forest was still. My breath drifted in front of me, white and fragile, no wind, no footsteps, just that endless wall of black trees pressing in. "Who's there?" I called out. My voice sounded too loud, like it didn't belong in that kind of silence. No answer. I swept the beam of my light across the clearing, nothing but pine trunks rough and wet with dew. Then, faintly, I heard it again. Not on the wall this time, but from the tree line. 3 knocks, slow and deliberate, echoing just beyond the reach of the light. I remember standing there, trying to reason it out. Maybe it was a woodpecker, maybe a branch tapping against another. But the knocks were too evenly spaced, too intentional. I waited, listened. The forest held its breath. The next morning, I found prints in the mud beside the cabin. 5 of them, large, flat, spaced too far apart for a man to make. The heel impressions were deep, like something heavy had walked there, but the toes, if you could call them that, were long and curved, dragging slightly as if clawed. I took plaster casts, logged them, and sent them to the regional office. They never responded. Over the following weeks, small things began to change. Tools left outside were found rearranged in the morning. The cabin door would be open when I woke up, though I was sure I'd locked it. I started hearing faint laughter on the radio, right between the static, just enough to make you question whether it was real. I stopped sleeping through the night. The pines around the cabin looked different after dark, taller somehow, as if they leaned closer when the light went out. Then came the search. A local boy had gone missing near the ridge. His parents said he'd gone mushroom picking with friends, but never came back. We organized a team, 5 rangers, 2 dogs, and a handful of volunteers. The forest was unusually quiet that day. Even the birds seemed to be listening. About a mile into the hollow, the dogs began to whine. One refused to move forward. The air turned heavy, damp, like walking into a cave. And then we saw it. Up ahead, half buried in ferns. A shoe. The boys, confirmed by the mother later. But it wasn't just a shoe, it was placed neatly on a rock facing east. No tracks, no drag marks, no sign of struggle. That night, as I sat by the cabin fire, I couldn't shake the image. The placement was too deliberate. I'd seen this kind of ritualistic display once before, years earlier after a landslide near Mount Adams. Local tribes had warned us not to disturb certain stone formations, said they were paths of return. I hadn't believed them then. Now I wasn't so sure. The forest isn't cruel, but it has rules, and I was starting to realize I'd broken one. The knocking returned the following evening. This time I didn't go outside. I sat by the table, gun drawn, listening to the slow rhythm move from one wall to another. Then it stopped. For a full minute, there was only silence, until I heard breathing. Deep, slow, steady, right outside the window. The flashlight beam trembled in my hand as I turned it toward the glass. For a moment, I saw only my reflection. Then behind it, something darker, a shape. Broad shoulders, too still to be human, too tall to fit through the door. When the beam flickered, it was gone. I didn't move for the rest of the night. At dawn, I found the same prints again, leading away from the cabin and down toward the creek. They stopped at the edge of the water, as if whatever made them had stepped in and vanished. I radioed the district office, told them I thought we might have a bear behaving unusually. They sent a biologist the next day. We spent hours examining the site, measuring the impressions, looking for scat, fur, any sign of animal behavior. There was nothing. Before he left, the biologist looked at me and said quietly, "You know, there are stories about these woods, things older than bears." I laughed it off then, but his eyes didn't. That night, I went down to the creek alone. I told myself I was gathering evidence, but really, I needed to know, needed to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my grip. The forest was different under moonlight. Washed in silver, stripped of warmth, the water ran black, reflecting nothing. I stood there for a long time, listening. That's when I heard the whisper. It came from the other side of the creek, soft, almost tender, a voice that could have been carried by the wind if the trees weren't dead still. It spoke my name, slowly, carefully, as though tasting it for the first time. The flashlight flickered again, and for one heartbeat I saw movement. A figure slipping between the trunks, broad and hunched, its skin pale as birch bark. Then it was gone, leaving only the echo of my name drifting through the hollow. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that, and when I finally did, I dreamed of caves, dark, breathing places deep beneath the pines where voices echoed without mouths and something massive stirred behind stone walls. When I woke from that dream, my throat was dry and raw as if I'd been shouting. The room still carried the echo of my own breathing. The morning light was thin and gray, filtering through the frost that had gathered on the inside of the window. Outside, the forest looked drained, stripped of color. I could see the creek from here, a dark thread cutting through the valley, but something about it felt wrong, as if it were running in the opposite direction. I told myself I was imagining it. That's what happens when exhaustion starts to blur with fear. You rationalize the impossible. The mind protects itself by giving you smaller lies to believe in. I brewed coffee strong enough to peel paint and stepped outside. The forest greeted me with its usual stillness, but beneath it, something lingered. The kind of quiet that doesn't wait, it watches. There was a smell in the air I hadn't noticed before, metallic, faintly sweet, like rust mixed with wildflowers. It reminded me of an old campsite I'd stumbled upon years ago. Torn tents, no people, just that same smell in the dirt. It had clung to my clothes for days afterward, and now it was back, drifting through the morning air like memory itself. I checked the perimeter, measured the footprints again, took photographs for the record. But when I reviewed them on the cabin's laptop, the images were wrong, blurry, warped. The trees around the prints seemed to lean inward, bending toward something that wasn't in frame. By noon, fog began to rise from the hollow. It didn't move like normal fog. It crawled, slow and heavy, curling around tree trunks as though seeking something. My radio crackled with static. Then a voice, faint and fragmented. "Stay inside. Don't answer." Then silence. I recognized the voice. It was Sarah, another ranger stationed 2 valleys east. She was one of the few who understood this land's moods. We'd shared long nights on the trail, listening to the forest's breathing. I tried calling her back. Nothing. The static swallowed my words whole. Around dusk, a knock came at the door. Not the slow, deliberate rhythm from before, just one sharp, impatient strike. I froze. Then came another, softer. A familiar voice called through the wood. "Hey, you in there?" It was Sarah. Relief flooded through me so fast it made me dizzy. I opened the door before I could think better of it. She stood there in uniform, pale from the cold, her breath fogging the air. She looked tired, more than tired, haunted. "Radio's been out for hours," she said, stepping inside. "They told me to check on you, said they couldn't raise your signal." I nodded, still half in disbelief that she was real. "Yeah, I've been having some trouble with interference. You must have passed through the fog." Her eyes flicked toward the window. "That's not fog," she said quietly. "It's smoke." We stepped outside again. The air was thick, gray-green, swirling low to the ground. It didn't smell like fire, no ash, no burn, just that same strange sweetness, like rusted flowers. "Forest Service didn't authorize any burns this week," I said. She shook her head. "It's not from any fire. It's coming from the caves near Ridge Point. Locals called it the breath of the pines. My grandmother used to talk about it, said it happens when something wakes up down there." Her voice trembled when she said that last part. I wanted to tell her to stop, to not bring old stories into this. But the truth is, I'd already been thinking the same thing. That night, we stayed awake by the fire, trying to make sense of the air, the fog, the missing boy. I told her about the knocking, the footprints, the voice that had spoken my name. She didn't laugh. She just stared at the flames, her face hollow in the orange light. "I've heard it too," she said finally. "Last winter, near the caves. It called my name the same way." I didn't ask what she did after that. I didn't need to. We both knew some things in the forest aren't meant to be followed. The next morning, the fog was thicker than I'd ever seen. It muffled sound, turning every noise into something distant, disembodied. Sarah said she was going to hike toward Ridge Point to check the source. I argued, told her we should wait for backup. But she was stubborn. She always had been. Before leaving, she handed me a flare gun and a map. "If I'm not back by dark," she said, "don't look for me. Go north, past the river. There's an old ranger outpost burnt down, but the radio tower still works." Then she was gone, swallowed by the trees. Hours passed. The fog never lifted. I walked the perimeter again and again, losing track of time. My coffee went cold. The forest seemed to shift around me, the trees rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking. By mid-afternoon, I heard it again, the knocking. But this time, it came from inside the tree line, deeper, faster. Then a faint scream, cut short. "Sarah?" I called out, though my voice barely carried. No answer, just the forest breathing back. I grabbed my flashlight, rifle, and pack, then pushed into the mist. Visibility was down to 10 feet. The light cut through the gray like a blade, revealing shapes that moved just out of reach. Every sound was amplified. The crunch of needles beneath my boots, the drip of moisture from branches, the faint, rhythmic thud ahead of me. Knocking. It led me uphill, toward Ridge Point. The smell grew stronger with every step, metallic, almost bloody. Then I saw the cave mouth through the fog, wide, gaping, like the forest had torn open its own skin. The knock stopped the moment I saw it. For a long time, I just stood there, staring into that darkness. The air coming from the cave was warm, humid, and faintly vibrating, as if the earth itself were breathing. Then I saw her, Sarah's backpack, half buried in the mud near the entrance. "Sarah." No response. I stepped closer, and that's when I heard the whisper again. My name, drawn out long and low, almost coaxing. Then another voice, hers this time, faint and far away, repeating the same thing. It didn't sound like she was calling for help. It sounded like she was inside, trying to get me to come closer. My instincts screamed to run, but reason betrayed me. I had to know. I stepped into the cave. The air was thick, wet, pulsing with some hidden rhythm. My flashlight beam shuddered across the walls, shimmering with moisture, streaked with something that looked like old blood. The tunnel curved downward, deeper and deeper, until the light from outside was gone. I could still hear her voice, now clearer, echoing ahead. But it wasn't alone. Something else moved beside it, a low rumble, almost like laughter or breathing too big to belong to a person. When I reached the chamber, the ground was covered in pine needles, though no trees grew here. The scent of sap and iron filled the air, and in the center I saw them. Figures. Not alive. Not exactly dead either. Shapes of bark and moss, half human, their faces stretched and hollow, their eyes filled with reflected light. And at the back of the chamber, something massive stirred. Its outline was indistinct, lost in shadow, but when it moved, the ground trembled. The voice, Sarah's voice, came from it. "Come closer," it said. "It's beautiful down here." My light flickered once, then went out. I fired the flare. The red light burst across the chamber, and for one terrible second, I saw everything. The walls pulsing with roots, faces trapped within them, mouths open in silent screams, and the thing in the center, a towering form, fur matted with sap, eyes white as bone, its limbs bending wrong. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't human. It was something the forest had made, and it was smiling. I ran. I didn't look back. Not once. The walls of the cave seemed to close around me as I ran, the ground soft and uneven, roots clutching at my boots like fingers. My breath came in short, ragged gasps, and with every exhale, the air seemed thicker, wetter, as if I were running through lungs instead of earth. The sound behind me wasn't footsteps. It was the shifting of something too large, too patient. I burst out into the fog like a drowning man breaking the surface. My hands hit cold moss, and for a moment I just lay there, coughing, waiting for air to find me again. The forest was silent, the kind of silence that makes you wonder if sound itself has died. The cave mouth yawned behind me, dark and slick, but nothing emerged. The mist rolled low, coiling around my legs. Then I saw movement, ripples in the fog, like something heavy moving beneath it. I stumbled to my feet and began the long trek back to the cabin. My flashlight was gone, my rifle somewhere in the dark, but I still had the flare gun. Every few steps, I glanced behind me, half expecting to see those pale eyes floating between the trees. By the time I reached the cabin, the world was dimming into dusk. The forest looked different, stretched somehow, as though the trees had grown taller while I was gone. I slammed the door, locked it, then pushed the table and a chair against it. I lit a lantern and sat with my back to the wall, staring at the windows. The fog pressed against the glass like breath. I kept waiting for the knock, but it didn't come, not that night. What came instead was a voice. It started softly, like wind through pine needles, then grew clearer. A woman's voice humming a tune I didn't recognize. It came from the tree line, moving slowly around the cabin. The melody was wrong. Too slow, too low, bending at strange intervals like it wasn't built for human lungs. And then it said my name. Not the voice from before, not the deep, wet murmur of whatever was in the cave. This one sounded exactly like Sarah. "Please," it said from just beyond the window. "You have to help me." Every instinct in my body told me not to move, but my hands still went to the lock. "Please," the voice said again. "It's cold out here. Let me in." The lantern flickered. For a second, her face appeared in the glass, pale, smiling too wide, her eyes unfocused. I fired the flare gun without thinking. The red light burst through the window and illuminated the clearing outside. For one instant, I saw it. Not her, not exactly, but something that wore her shape. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending backward. And behind it, shadows stretched upward, branching out like antlers. The thing moved with a jerking grace, too smooth to be human, but too deliberate to be animal. And when the flare burned out, the darkness swallowed it whole. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the flare gun, waiting for the next sound. None came. The next morning, I packed everything I could carry, radio, maps, a few cans of food, and started north toward the old outpost. The fog had thinned, but the air still carried that strange sweetness. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the forest didn't want me to leave. About 2 miles in, I found something hanging from a tree. It was a ranger's badge, suspended by a strip of torn fabric. The number on it was Sarah's. The forest was quiet again, but I could feel movement beneath it. The subtle shifting of roots, the soft sigh of earth adjusting to something buried deep. I pushed on, forcing myself not to think. The trail wound uphill, through pines so dense they blocked the sun. Somewhere ahead, water dripped steadily like a clock marking time. I began to feel lightheaded, my vision swimming. That's when I saw the first carving, a tree trunk cut deep with symbols, circles and slashes arranged like a map I couldn't read. The bark around it was blackened, as though burned from within. I passed more of them as I climbed. Each one felt older, angrier. By the time I reached the ridge, my body was shaking. The remains of the outpost stood ahead, charred and skeletal, so the radio tower leaning like a broken finger against the sky. I climbed the stairs to what was left of the upper platform. From there, I could see the valley below, a sea of mist and pine, endless and unmoving. I powered up the old radio, its metal casing rusted and cold. Static filled the air, a faint hum of ghosts whispering through the wires. "This is Ranger." I hesitated. My own name suddenly felt foreign, like saying it would draw attention. "This is Station 3. If anyone's receiving, I need..." A voice cut through the static. "Copy that," it said. "We've been trying to reach you." It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't anyone I recognized. The tone was calm, steady, almost soothing. "Stay where you are," the voice continued. "Help is coming." I felt a rush of relief until I heard something else beneath it. Faint. Slow. 3 knocks. The voice spoke again, clearer now, but the cadence had changed. The words were the same, but they didn't sound human anymore. "Stay where you are." Then silence. I yanked the plug from the radio. The world around me seemed to tilt, the forest bending inward like a wave collapsing. The air hummed with low vibration, like distant thunder underground. That's when the ground gave a long, tired sigh. It wasn't an earthquake, it was breathing. I staggered to the edge of the platform and looked down. The pines in the valley were swaying, not from wind, but in unison, like a pulse moving through the earth. The fog twisted between them, forming shapes that almost looked like faces before dissolving again. And then I saw movement at the base of the ridge, dark shapes emerging from the mist. They walked slowly, in a line, their heads bowed. Dozens of them, maybe more. I grabbed my binoculars, though I already knew what I'd see. Their skin looked like bark, their clothes molded into their bodies, eyes hollow and milky white. They moved with purpose, carrying something heavy between them. A body, limp and small. The boy, the one who'd gone missing. They laid him gently at the edge of the trees, then turned their heads toward the ridge, toward me. The air went still, and from every direction the forest whispered. Not words, just a sound like breath through dry needles. But beneath it, I could hear something forming, a rhythm, a chant, ancient and deep. Then one of them raised its head, and I realized with a cold certainty that it had Sarah's face. I didn't stay to watch the rest. I grabbed what I could and ran down the opposite side of the ridge. The forest seemed endless, shifting around me. Every path I took circled back to the same clearing. Every tree looked familiar, but none of them were. The whispers followed, always just behind me, always just out of reach. I remember tripping over a root, falling hard into the dirt. When I looked up, the ground beneath me wasn't earth, it was wood. Rings of an enormous tree, carved with faces. They looked up at me, mouths open in silent terror. Then everything went black. When I came to, it was dawn again. I was lying near my cabin. No fog, no sound, just sunlight filtering through the pines like nothing had ever happened. But the door was open. And inside, the floor was covered in fresh pine needles, laid in a perfect spiral leading to the table. My radio sat on top, turned on. Static filled the air. Then a voice. My voice. Repeating the same words over and over. "Stay where you are, help is coming." I don't remember turning the radio off. I only remember staring at it, watching the red light on the dial blink like a heartbeat in the dark. Every blink seemed slower than the last, as though time itself were losing its rhythm. I could still hear my own voice coming through the speaker, repeating the same words over and over, but by the 4th repetition, It no longer sounded like me. It was lower, dragged, like someone trying to imitate a sound they didn't understand. Stay where you are. Help is coming. I pulled the plug from the wall. The voice didn't stop. That's when I realized it wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was coming from outside. The forest echoed it back, my words bouncing through the pines, distorted, layered, as if dozens of unseen mouths were whispering them at once. I backed away from the table, tripping over the spiral of pine needles on the floor. When I hit the ground, I noticed something strange about the needles. They were fresh, still wet with sap, as though torn from living branches. And underneath them, carved shallow into the wood floor, was the same symbol I'd seen on the trees near the ridge. Circles and lines forming a crude map that led nowhere. The whispering outside grew louder. I could hear movement between the trees, the crunch of leaves, the groan of wood under weight. My reflection in the window trembled as the glass itself began to hum. That was when the lights went out. The lantern sputtered and died, plunging the cabin into blackness. I could still make out faint silhouettes beyond the window, tall, slow-moving figures swaying in rhythm, their limbs blending with the trunks behind them. And from somewhere deep in the forest, something massive answered with a long, low call. It was not a roar. It wasn't even entirely sound, more like vibration, traveling through the ground, through my bones, through the air I breathed. I crawled toward the back wall, groping for the flare gun I'd set down earlier. When I found it, I waited, barely breathing. The first knock came seconds later, 3 slow strikes on the cabin door, then silence. I aimed the flare gun toward the sound, fingers shaking on the trigger. My heartbeat felt like thunder in my chest. Another knock. Louder. Go away, I whispered, but the voice that came from my throat didn't sound like mine anymore. It was hoarse, foreign, hollow. The third knock came from the wall behind me. I fired. The flare burst into light, filling the cabin with harsh red glow. For an instant, the walls seemed to ripple as though they were breathing. The spiral of needles on the floor caught the light and shimmered like blood. And in the doorway, something stood. Its outline filled the frame from floor to ceiling. The flare's light caught its eyes first, pale, lidless, reflecting not red but a cold, bluish white. Its body was draped in something that looked like moss or fur matted with earth. Its mouth opened wide enough to split its jawline, revealing teeth that didn't look built for eating, but for tearing roots out of stone. Behind it, more shapes moved, figures half-formed, crawling from the fog. The flare burned out, leaving me in darkness again. I don't remember how I got out. Only that when I came to, I was outside, running through the forest barefoot, my feet cut open by pine cones and rock. The night air was cold enough to burn my lungs, but the smell of iron and sap kept me moving. The forest wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive with sound, a symphony of whispers and groaning trees, as though the land itself was shifting to let something pass. I ran until my legs gave out. I fell near a clearing and lay still, the ground soft beneath me, covered in moss that pulsed faintly with warmth. When I looked up, the stars were wrong. They didn't shimmer, they pulsed. Slowly, like eyes blinking from an impossible distance, something moved at the edge of the clearing. A figure, human-sized, hunched, watching me. Its skin shone faintly, damp like bark after rain. For a moment, I thought it might be Sarah. "Help me," it said in her voice. But when it stepped closer, I saw that its face wasn't a face anymore. It was a mask of stretched bark, the mouth too smooth, the eyes too deep. It crouched beside me, tilting its head as though curious. Then it pressed its hand to my chest. The skin was cold, rough, almost wooden, but I could feel something beneath it, movement, faint vibrations like roots threading through soil. And in that moment, I understood what this place wanted. It wasn't hunting. It was harvesting. Everything that died here, every ranger, every lost hiker, every animal that wandered too deep, didn't vanish. They became part of it. The forest didn't consume, it recycled, it remembered. It built itself from what it took. I pushed away, stumbled to my feet, and ran again. I don't know how long I ran, only that the forest never ended. The same trees, the same fog, the same symbols on bark, time folded in on itself. When I finally saw the lights of another ranger station, it felt like salvation. I burst through the door, shouting, gasping for air. The man inside turned toward me, his face lined and weathered. He looked familiar in a way that chilled me. "You made it," he said calmly, like he'd been expecting me. "Took you long enough." I tried to speak, but my throat locked up. He gestured toward the wall behind him. Hanging there, under the faded ranger insignia, was a photograph, black and white, old, the kind you'd find in archives. It was a picture of a ranger crew standing in front of a tower, and right in the middle, staring dead at the camera, was me. Same face, same uniform. But the date on the plaque read 1947. The man smiled. "You'll learn, like the rest of us did, the forest doesn't forget its own." Then the floor trembled again, that deep subterranean pulse shaking dust from the rafters. The lanterns flickered. Outside, the fog returned, creeping under the door. I backed toward the exit, but he just watched, unmoving. "You'll go back," he said. "They all do. That's the rule." His eyes were hollow, and for a moment I saw pine needles growing from his wrists. I turned and ran out into the fog. The forest closed behind me, and the knocking began again, this time not on doors, but from beneath the ground. 3 beats, slow and patient. Somewhere in the distance I heard my voice again, echoing through the trees, calm and steady. "Stay where you are. Help is coming." Only now, I knew what it really meant. It wasn't a promise. It was a warning. I'm still out here, somewhere between the pines and the caves, between what breathes and what waits. Some nights, I think I hear the radio again, faint through the mist, and I almost answer. But I don't, because I finally understand the truth the locals always whispered. The forest doesn't haunt you. It keeps you. And when it whispers your name, it isn't calling you in fear. It's calling you home. I used to think the forest was just trees and wind, a body of green that stretched beyond reason but never beyond understanding. I was wrong. The forest isn't a place, it's a presence. And once it knows your name, you never walk out the same man again. My name's Cole. I've been a forest ranger for the better part of 22 years, stationed in the Bitterroot Range of western Montana, where the mountains rise like ribs of an old god, and the nights stretch too long to measure. When people think of Montana, they picture beauty. Sunrise on alpine lakes, elk grazing in the mist, stars so bright they hum. But beauty has edges here. The woods hide their dead well, and some stories don't make it into the logbooks. When I first took the job, I was young, stubborn, idealistic, thinking this uniform meant I'd mastered the wild. But the truth is, you don't protect the forest. The forest allows you to stay, and sometimes it decides you've stayed too long. The locals have a phrase they whisper half-jokingly, "Don't whistle after dark." They say sound carries differently here, that the pines listen, and sometimes they answer. You laugh it off the first few years. Then one night, you find yourself holding your breath when the wind dies, waiting to hear something that shouldn't exist. That's when you start believing. It began one winter, late December, the kind of cold that makes the snow squeak beneath your boots. I'd been posted near Trapper Peak Station, miles from the nearest town, doing routine patrols along the old fire roads. There'd been reports of animal mutilations, elk carcasses stripped clean in strange patterns. Locals blamed wolves. I wasn't so sure. Wolves don't leave bones stacked like cairns. The day was silent. Snow muffled everything. I remember the light, gray and heavy, like it didn't want to reach the ground. I was checking a weather sensor when I noticed it, a footprint in the snow. Not quite human, not quite animal. Long, narrow, deep enough to hold water from the thaw. The stride was huge, nearly 7 feet apart. I followed it for a while, half out of duty, half out of curiosity. Every few yards, the air felt denser, like sound couldn't escape. Then came the smell. Not decay exactly, more like iron and wet pine needles, something primal that made the back of my neck tighten. The tracks led down into a gully where the snow thinned around exposed rock. I crouched beside one and ran my glove through the print. The snow had melted deeper than the surrounding surface, as if whatever left it radiated heat. I stood still, trying to listen over the pounding in my chest. That's when I heard it. Not a growl, not a howl, a rhythm. 3 slow knocks echoing through the pines. It came once, then again, the sound of wood striking wood, deliberate and far too measured for any animal. I knew then that I wasn't alone. At the time, I told myself it was just a falling branch, maybe a woodpecker. Rangers rationalize it's how we survive. But when I got back to the station, the radio was dead. Battery drained. My backup flashlight too. I tried the generator. Nothing. Just the sound of the wind outside, slow and scraping like someone dragging a stick along the siding. I barely slept that night. I dreamed of walking through the forest and hearing someone behind me breathe. Every time I turned, I saw the same line of footprints vanishing into the dark. When the snow thawed in spring, we found more tracks, bigger, deeper, leading toward an abandoned ranger cabin 3 miles out. The place hadn't been used since the 70s. I went with another ranger, Mark, to inspect it. The cabin door was off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with rot and old fur. In the corner lay what looked like a stack of elk skulls arranged in a circle. Mark muttered a prayer under his breath. "Mountain spirits," he said, half serious. "The locals say this ridge belonged to them." I wanted to laugh, but something in his tone stopped me. I kept thinking about those knocks in the forest, about how they had matched my heartbeat. That night, when I returned alone to my post, I found something nailed to the station door, a clump of wet fur, gray as ash, matted with resin. I burned it in the stove without thinking. The smoke smelled like blood and rain. From then on, the forest changed for me. Every patrol felt heavier. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was watching. The weeks that followed blurred together in the way only isolation can twist time. Out there, the forest becomes a mirror, and if you stare long enough, it starts to show you things you didn't ask to see. The sound of your own breathing becomes the forest's voice. You start doubting what's inside your head and what's outside the window. I started hearing footsteps around the cabin at night. Slow, circling, as if something was tracing the edge of my patrol lights just out of sight. At first, I figured it was a bear. We get plenty of them, especially near the lower creek. But no bear moves like that, deliberate, pausing between steps like it's waiting for you to notice. The strange thing is, it never came close enough to see. I'd rush outside, sweep my flashlight across the snow, and find nothing. No tracks, no sound. Just the wind in the branches and that crushing quiet that feels thicker than fog. I began marking the nights on a map. Whatever it was seemed to circle in a wider radius every few days, always returning to the same invisible path. Then came the radio call. A hiker had gone missing. A local hunter named Briggs, tough old man who'd lived in these woods longer than most of us. They said he'd gone out to check his traps and never came back. I joined the search party. 2 days in, we found his rifle propped neatly against a tree like he just stepped away for a smoke. But there were no prints around it, not one. We spread out, calling his name until our voices cracked. By sundown, the others turned back, but I stayed behind, convinced I'd seen movement down by the ravine. The air there felt wrong. Still, heavy, like 1,000 breaths held at once. I remember kneeling to check a patch of disturbed earth. That's when I caught it. That same smell from winter, iron and pine and something older, something like heat and wet stone. I turned toward the ridge, and that's when I heard it again, 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, hollow as if from inside the trees themselves. I froze. The sound came again, closer this time, and I realized it wasn't wood hitting wood. It was hand against trunk. Something large shifted between the trees. The pines swayed, but the air stayed still, and then silence. Not the kind that comes from distance. The kind that presses against your eardrums until you feel like you're underwater. I don't remember running back. I just remember the forest opening up around me like it wanted to swallow me whole. When I finally stumbled out onto the fire road, the sky had gone black, though my watch said it was barely 4 in the afternoon. That night, when I wrote my report, I couldn't bring myself to mention the knocks. I wrote about animal activity, wind displacement, atmospheric pressure. You learn early on that some truths get you sent home on medical leave. A few days later, I got a call from headquarters. They'd found Briggs, or what was left of him. No sign of attack, no broken bones, no blood, just his body sitting upright beneath a pine, eyes open, mouth full of dirt like he'd been trying to speak to the ground. After the recovery, I volunteered to burn the site, standard procedure when an animal carcass or human remains might attract predators. I went alone. The fire caught fast, licking up the dry pine needles until smoke rolled down the slope. I remember watching it rise, thinking maybe the forest would let him rest. That's when I heard something through the crackle, faint, rhythmic, carried on the wind. 3 knocks. Again. I dropped the torch and spun around. No one there, just flame and shadow. But the knocks kept coming. Slower this time, heavier. And I swear to God, they echoed my heartbeat. That night, I didn't sleep. I packed my gear, double-checked the doors, and sat in silence until dawn. When the first light came, I stepped outside and found footprints leading away from my cabin. They weren't mine. Each print was nearly twice the size of my boot. The snow inside slightly melted as if the ground had been warm where it stepped. They led into the pines and disappeared after 30 yards, where the needles thickened into a bed of moss. I followed them, but they just stopped. Like whatever made them had lifted itself off the ground and vanished. I reported the tracks. The ranger who came to inspect, a man named Hollis, laughed it off, said the thaw was playing tricks, melting and refreezing prints into odd shapes. He left me with a pat on the shoulder and a look that said, "You're spooked, old man." Maybe he was right. Maybe it was the isolation. But that night, I woke to a sound that didn't belong, humming. A low, guttural vibration drifting through the walls. It wasn't a voice, not exactly, but it had cadence, like someone trying to remember a tune they'd once known. I stepped outside with my flashlight. The air was cold, sharp enough to cut breath. The trees swayed slow, groaning under their own weight. And there, between 2 trunks, something moved. Tall, too tall. The light caught it for just a second. Gray fur, slick and wet, a head bent forward like it carried the forest on its shoulders. Then it was gone, swallowed by darkness before my brain could even form the word. I stood there long after the light failed, listening to my pulse drum in my ears, until the sound faded into the distance. 3 knocks again, softer this time, like a farewell. I didn't tell anyone. Not yet. There are things you can't explain, and admitting them only makes them more real. But the forest wasn't done with me. Because a week later, I found Hollis's truck parked along the ridge road, engine running, door wide open inside, his ranger hat, his radio, his lunch still warm, and on the ground beside it, a single footprint, long, narrow, deep enough to hold the truth I didn't want to face. After Hollis disappeared, something in the forest shifted, or maybe it was just something in me. The silence didn't feel like silence anymore. It felt like breath held just beneath the bark. I kept telling myself it was grief or guilt, but the truth was simpler and harder. I'd started to believe the woods were alive in a way I wasn't meant to understand. Headquarters sent a small team to search for Hollis. They found tire marks, some disturbed branches, and that was it. No struggle, no blood, no sign of him heading anywhere. They chalked it up to mental fatigue, said he might have wandered off under stress. Happens more often than you'd think, they told me. I didn't argue. I just nodded and offered to finish his patrol routes until a replacement came in. I needed to see those ridges again. That's how I found the cave. It was an afternoon heavy with mist. The kind that makes the world look half forgotten. I was hiking the north slope near Raven Ridge, an area we rarely visited because of old mining shafts and unstable ground. The forest there grows different, pines tall and thin, their trunks pale like bone, and moss thick enough to swallow a boot. I was cutting across a frozen creek when I saw it, a hollow opening behind a curtain of fallen branches. Not large enough for a bear den, but too symmetrical to be natural. I hesitated. Every ranger learns not to explore alone, but I couldn't stop staring at that dark mouth in the hillside. Something about it felt familiar, like a shape I'd seen before in a dream. I stepped closer, swept my flashlight through the entrance. The air inside shimmered with moisture. The walls glistened like polished obsidian, unnaturally smooth. My breath echoed back at me, slower than I exhaled it, delayed as if the cave was breathing me in and out. A few feet in, I noticed carvings along the stone, faint, half erased, lines, circles, symbols I couldn't name. They pulsed in the beam of my light, not glowing exactly, just catching light in a way that suggested they wanted to. Then I saw the pile. At first I thought it was rocks, but as I leaned closer, I saw the curve of a jawbone, the hollow of an eye socket. Animal skulls, stacked into a spiral, elk, fox, wolf, even bird skulls, each one facing inward. And in the center, something human. The remains were old, dry, but arranged with intention. I stumbled back and nearly dropped my light. The moment it hit the ground, the sound rippled through the cave, like striking a drum underwater. Then came the whispering, not from outside, not in the wind, inside the rock itself. It wasn't words at first, just cadence, like hearing breath through a wall, an ancient rhythm. Then slowly syllables formed. I couldn't tell what language, but it had structure, weight. Every sound pressed into my skull until it felt like memory. I stumbled toward the entrance, gasping for air that didn't feel borrowed. As I broke into daylight, the whispering stopped. The forest was still, too still. And there, across the creek, stood something watching. Tall, motionless, framed between the trees. Its skin was pale and gray, fur clinging to the shoulders like rags, its head tilted as though curious. I wanted to believe it was an illusion, a trick of light or exhaustion. But then it moved. Not toward me, sideways, one slow step that made no sound in the snow. I blinked, and it was gone. When I got back to the station, I collapsed into the chair and tried to record everything, the cave, the carvings, the creature, but my radio started crackling halfway through. Static, then faint knocking. 3 beats. Slow, patient. I turned it off. That night, I dreamed of the cave. Only this time I was inside, kneeling before the spiral of skulls. Something moved behind me, breath hot on my neck, and a voice deep as stone settling whispered, "You hear us now." I woke drenched in sweat. The fire burned out, my boots wet as though I'd been outside. There was mud on the floor. Pine needles clung to the soles. I checked the door, locked from the inside. I didn't report it, not because I didn't believe, but because belief had started to feel like a curse. The next morning, I hiked back to the cave, but it wasn't there. The hillside was solid rock. No opening, no hollow, no sign it had ever existed. Only the creek below and a ring of dead pine needles where nothing grew. I stood there for a long time, the world quiet except for the faint hum of wind through branches. And then I heard it, far away, faint, but real. A single knock, followed by 2 more. Somewhere deep in those woods, something was calling back. From that day forward, the locals avoided that ridge entirely. Even the animals did. The deer trails veered wide, birds refused to nest near it. The few who wandered close said they heard voices after dark, low and mournful, like a choir of wind through hollow bones. When I mentioned it to an old tracker named Inez, she crossed herself and told me an old story. Said the Salish tribes once believed certain mountains were listening places, places where the dead spoke through trees. Spirits that remembered everyone who entered. Inez said those who heard them too long would start answering back until they forgot which side of the echo they were on. I tried to laugh it off, but that night when I lay in bed, I caught myself whispering into the dark. Not words, just rhythm. 3 slow taps against the nightstand, like answering a call I didn't remember receiving. I started losing time after that. I'd wake up in new parts of the forest with no memory of hiking there. My patrol notebook filled itself with strange drawings, spirals, circles, symbols that looked like the ones from the cave. I'd find pine needles in my pockets, dirt under my nails, even when I hadn't left the station for days. The forest was inside me now, and still, every night, the knocks came, steady as breath. 3 beats, A pause, then silence long enough to make you believe it was over. Until the next set began, I began to wonder if the thing I saw wasn't a creature at all. Maybe it was a memory, a shape the forest used to speak. Maybe Hollis hadn't disappeared. Maybe he'd just been remembered by the wrong side of the mountain. The strangest part was I stopped feeling afraid. Fear gave way to curiosity, then to something like reverence. I started walking toward the sounds instead of away from them. Each night, deeper. Each night, closer to whatever waited between those trees. Because part of me had begun to believe that the forest wasn't hunting me. It was trying to teach me something. It's strange, the peace that comes after you stop fighting what you don't understand. When fear finally burns itself out, what's left isn't bravery, it's surrender. You stop asking why. You stop demanding logic from things older than language. You just listen. By the time spring came, the woods had changed colors. Not the trees, not the moss, but the way light moved through them. It wasn't sunlight anymore. It was something filtered, thick, almost deliberate. The forest had grown denser, more symmetrical. I started noticing patterns. Trees aligned in strange angles, paths that seemed to rearrange themselves overnight. The air carried the same slow rhythm I'd heard in the Knox, like the whole valley was breathing. I couldn't stay in the ranger station anymore. Every creak in the wood sounded like footsteps. Every reflection in the window moved a heartbeat too late. So I left. No gear, no radio, just a notebook and my flashlight. I told myself I was going to find the truth, but part of me already knew I was going back home. The forest felt alive as I entered it, not metaphorically, not spiritually, alive. The pines leaned toward me like sentries, their branches whispering across each other in low, tonal patterns. My boots sank into moss that pulsed faintly underfoot as if blood moved beneath it. After hours of walking, I reached the ravine, the one where we'd found Briggs. The ground there had changed too. Where the creek had once run, there was a depression filled with fog, coiling like smoke. And just above it, half hidden by vines, was the cave. It shouldn't have been there. I'd seen this slope sealed by rock. But there it was again, open, waiting. I stepped closer. The air that poured out was warm, like breath exhaled from the lungs of the earth. The same smell, iron, resin, wet pine, wrapped around me like a memory I couldn't shake. My flashlight flickered as I crossed the threshold. Inside, the walls shimmered again with those same markings, though now they seemed sharper, clearer. The spiral of skulls was gone, replaced by something worse. Shadows moving in the stone, faint outlines that shifted when I blinked. Faces half-formed, watching. Then I heard it, the knocks. Only this time they weren't outside or far away. They came from behind me. I turned, heart pounding, and there it was, the figure. Taller than any man, shoulders broad, fur matted with sap and ash. Its eyes glowed faintly amber, not bright, just alive. But the worst part wasn't its face, it was its expression. It looked ancient, sad, like something that had carried the weight of this forest for too long. I stepped back, the light trembling in my hand. It didn't move, it just watched me, head tilted, the same rhythm in its breathing as the forest wind outside. Then, slow as dawn breaking, it raised one arm and pressed its hand against the cave wall. 3 times. Knock, knock, knock. The sound vibrated through the stone, into my chest, into my bones. The whispers started again, clearer this time. My name, over and over. 100 voices layered in one, calling not from around me, but from within me. My flashlight went out. Darkness swallowed everything, but I could still feel it there. Not as a presence, but as part of the air. The warmth behind me, the heartbeat of the cave. I don't remember dropping the light. I don't remember falling. Only the sound, the forest's pulse merging with mine until I couldn't tell the difference. When I opened my eyes again, it was morning. I was lying outside the cave, the ground soft with dew. The entrance was gone. Just solid rock. The notebook lay beside me, pages damp, filled with drawings I didn't remember making, spirals, eyes, trees growing from skulls. I stumbled back to the station in silence. The radio, dead for months, crackled to life as soon as I stepped inside. Static first, then a voice. Calm, steady. "Cole," it said. "Do you hear us?" I froze. My hand hovered over the switch. I wanted to respond, but something inside me whispered not to. The static rose and fell, then faded into 3 knocks. After that day, I filed my resignation, told them the isolation had gotten to me, that I needed rest. They let me go without question. But even after I left the mountains, the forest never left me. I'd wake at night to the sound of tapping, not outside, not on the walls, but from beneath the floor. 3 knocks, patient and deliberate. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I'd see the ridgeline, the cave, the pale figure waiting in the mist. I tried moving away, Oregon, Colorado, Arizona, but the woods have long arms. Pines grow everywhere, and every one of them carries a hum when the wind runs through, a rhythm I can't unhear. Eventually, I stopped running. Now I live near the base of the range again, in a small cabin far from the park borders. People come by sometimes, hikers, campers, green kids who want to hear ghost stories from the old ranger. I tell them pieces, never the whole thing. I tell them about Briggs, about Hollis, about the rules the locals whisper. Never whistle after dark, never follow 3 knocks, never look too long into the pines when they start to move. And every now and then, when the wind turns a certain way, I'll hear something distant, a hollow rhythm echoing through the valley. 3 beats, a pause, then silence. It doesn't scare me anymore. I think of it as a reminder that the forest doesn't belong to us, that there are stories written beneath our feet older than language itself, stories that remember. Maybe Hollis didn't vanish, maybe Briggs didn't die, maybe they were taken in, pulled into whatever keeps the pines whispering. Maybe one day, I will be too. Until then, I keep watch. I listen. And I remember that even the most devoted ranger is just a guest, one heartbeat in a forest that's been breathing since the first wind touched earth, because some spirits don't haunt to harm. Some haunt to remind you that you're still alive. And if you ever camp in the Bitterroot Range and the night grows too quiet and you hear 3 slow knocks echoing through the trees, don't answer, just listen and leave before dawn. In the summer of 2015, my best friend Scott and I, along with his oldest son David, embarked on our annual fishing trip to Morgan Monroe Reservoir. This tradition had been our escape from the grind of the work week, a cherished ritual we looked forward to every year. I would meet up at Scott's place, where we would load our fishing gear into his trusty old truck, eager to hit the road. At that time, I was only 28 years old, and I'd often teased David about enjoying his youth, warning him about the impending realities of adult life. Scott and I had shared a friendship spanning over a decade, one that resembled a brotherhood more than a mere friendship. We'd also worked together for the same amount of time, cementing our bond and treating each other like family. Our journey to our favorite fishing spot was always filled with excitement, and this year was no different. As we drove, we discussed our plans, with a pit stop for bait being our first order of business. I suggested we needed more bait, which irritated Scott slightly, but he agreed, understanding the desire to start fishing as soon as possible. Our pit stop at a small gas station in Martinsville provided us with worms and other essentials. We loaded up our supplies and continued the journey, listening to some classic rock tunes on the way. All 3 of us were bubbling with anticipation, eager to cast our lines into the water. As we arrived at our destination, a sign welcomed us, but it bore an ominous message: closed due to animal attack. The trail leading to the water was shrouded in shadows as the sun began to set. However, we paid little heed to the sign or the encroaching darkness. Both Scott and I were armed, and we felt confident in our ability to protect ourselves. We wasted no time setting up our gear by the water's edge, engaging in friendly banter about who would catch the most fish. David was the first to cast his line, boasting that he would outfish us. Scott and I scoffed and quickly followed suit, casting our lines into the water. Hours passed, and the night was filled with laughter and discussions ranging from cars and girls to work-related stories. At one point, David stood up, announcing that he needed to relieve himself. I handed him a flashlight, mindful of the darkness that had settled in. David took the light and disappeared into the woods. Around the same time, we began to hear an eerie knocking sound in the distance. Knock, knock. A shiver ran down my spine, but I initially dismissed it, thinking David was playing a prank. As David returned, Scott reprimanded him for potentially jeopardizing our remote location with pranks. However, David denied making the knocking sounds. Then the knocking noise resumed, louder and more unsettling than before. Knock, knock. I stood up, grabbing David's flashlight, directing it toward the source of the sound, but my beam revealed nothing unusual. Suddenly, something large crashed nearby. I pointed the flashlight in its direction and discovered a massive rock, possibly weighing 10 to 20 pounds or more. Scott began to worry that someone might be messing with us, but David raised the possibility of a bear. Fear had crept into his voice and eyes. I, however, knew that bears didn't typically engage in knocking or rock throwing. Concerned, I retrieved my firearm, ready to use it if necessary. For a while, the knocking and rock throwing ceased, and we thought the strange episode had ended. I glanced at my phone and realized it was nearly 3 in the morning, though it didn't feel like it. But then another knock echoed through the woods, followed by a chilling, inexplicable howl. Yell! The noise was uncomfortably close, sending shivers down my spine. I asked the others if they were ready to leave, and both Scott and David answered in the affirmative simultaneously. We hurriedly packed our belongings, and just as we were about to make our escape, another rock landed perilously close. It sounded as though something had hurled a massive boulder rather than a mere rock. All 3 of us froze, scanning our surroundings with our flashlights. Heavy footsteps were drawing nearer, and it seemed like whatever was responsible was in a hurry. Even with our flashlights, visibility was limited. David piped up, wondering if the area's closure was related to these strange occurrences. Scott and I remained silent, pressing forward down the trail that ran parallel to the water's edge. We still had nearly 100 yards to cover before reaching the truck. Then there was a loud kerplunk, followed by a splash just beside us. It sounded as if something had thrown a colossal boulder into the water. Our hearts raced, and adrenaline surged through our veins, pushing us onward. Both Scott and I had our firearms at the ready, prepared to use them if necessary. We continued to hear disturbing noises, including a blood-curdling screech reminiscent of a creature in agony. I asked Scott if the remote start worked from this distance. He reached for his key, but before he could respond, an abhorrent stench engulfed us. It was a putrid amalgamation of decaying trees and wet dog. The odor suggested that whatever was responsible was dangerously close, perhaps within arm's reach. We heard low growls just ahead, along with a loud crash and knocking noises as if something was slamming trees together. Finally, we reached the truck, its 4 windows shattered, and we discovered the source of the screeching sounds, a mangled raccoon. The gruesome sight did little to alleviate our panic. We piled into the truck, and Scott started the engine. When the truck's lights illuminated the area in front of us, we saw it. A dark, 7-foot-tall creature with reddish-yellow eyes. David pleaded with his dad to go faster, and Scott floored the gas pedal. A deafening bang reverberated through the air, causing the back of the truck to sway. However, we pressed on, our eyes wide and unblinking, the terror palpable. We arrived at Scott's house and stepped out of the truck, examining the damage more closely. The windows were shattered, and a colossal rock now rested in the back. The loud bang had been the Bigfoot throwing the rock at us. Scott looked at me, finally breaking the silence with disbelief in his voice. "Is that what I think it was?" I replied. "I think so." David, still in shock, attempted to explain the situation to his wife, but she dismissed it, assuming he had been drinking and wrecked the truck. I recounted the story to my wife, who merely laughed in disbelief. Despite our harrowing experience, it seemed that no one cared or believed us. As 2023 rolled around, we had not returned to that fishing spot. I often wondered if that Bigfoot had ever encountered anyone else in its remote habitat, and I hoped that they wouldn't meet the same terrifying fate as we had that eerie night in 2015. On a muggy late summer afternoon in the heart of Georgia, my husband, our 6-year-old son, and I found ourselves in search of a camping adventure. Instead of opting for a well-trodden, paid camping ground, we yearned for something a little more off the beaten path. Rumors had whispered to us about an old, abandoned camping site, a place no longer attended to or maintained. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to check it out. As we pulled up to the entrance, we were greeted by a sight that immediately sent chills down our spines. The gate to the old check-in booth was securely chained shut, a stark symbol of the site's disuse and neglect. This meant we'd have to park our car in the tree-lined wilderness and carry our camping gear on foot. After a short walk through the overgrown foliage, we began to spot remnants of old campsites, picnic tables covered in moss, fire pits choked with weeds, and other signs of abandonment. We pressed on, determined to find a spot near the tranquil pond we'd heard about, and continued our hike until we stumbled upon what seemed like the perfect camping spot. It was about a 15-minute trek from our car, nestled deep within the woods. As evening descended, we set up our campsite with a sense of anticipation and excitement. Our son eventually succumbed to the weariness of the day and fell into a peaceful slumber. My husband and I sat by the crackling campfire, enjoying the solitude. The silence stretched for miles around us, making it a bit overwhelming. But it was precisely when the silence was at its peak that something extraordinary occurred. Out of nowhere, we heard it. 6 loud, heavy, bipedal steps emanating from the water's edge. It was as if someone had emerged from an inner tube in the water and taken several deliberate, ground-shaking strides onto the shore. My initial thought was that a park ranger or police officer had discovered our car, located our campsite, and was making their way toward us to ask us to leave immediately. Yet, the sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It didn't resemble the cautious steps of an animal like a deer, muskrat, beaver, or even a bear, which shouldn't have been in our region. Instead, it was heavy and deliberate, far more intimidating than any animal could ever be. My husband, a tough guy who wasn't easily rattled, sprang to his feet feeling defensive and genuinely afraid. At that moment, my blood ran ice cold. We hastily turned on our flashlights, instinctively grabbing a nearby pocket knife and a sturdy stick, prepared for whatever might be approaching. We waited in tense silence for the intruder to reveal themselves. Strangely, no park ranger or officer announced their presence, and no deer darted into view. It was just eerie silence. Then, true terror set in. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone with malicious intent was lurking nearby, waiting for the right moment to strike. I mustered the courage to quiver out a shaky hello, much like in horror films just before a gruesome attack, but there was no response, just continued silence. Suddenly, we heard branches cracking, not on the ground, but overhead. All around us, rapidly and loudly, pine cones fell to the forest floor, echoing the snapping branches. It sounded as if 100 squirrels had simultaneously gone mad, ascending the trees and sending the forest into chaos. But no matter where we shone our lights, we saw nothing. The cacophony continued relentlessly, as if it had no intention of ceasing. We stood there, petrified, unable to do anything except listen and wait for any sign of movement. It was as though we were being toyed with. Sounds came from above, below, in the trees, in the water, from every direction. There were no animal sounds, no growls, grunts, or squeaks. The noises and their patterns were not natural, normal, or recognizable. I felt utterly cornered. All I wanted was to wake our child, hold him in my arms, abandon our belongings, and sprint back to the car as fast as humanly possible. However, we were a good 15-minute walk from the car, and I could hardly move, let alone run into the dark woods with this unknown presence surrounding us. It all became a blur, but I remember us retreating to the tent, huddling inside with our son, waiting for whatever would happen next. The noises persisted loudly and without respite. Sometimes they were close, and at other times they seemed far away. Sometimes they were loud in the water, and then in the trees. What kind of creature or entity could exist both on land and in the water, moving with such incredible speed and making its presence known in so many places simultaneously? It was becoming maddening, but that was the extent of it. Terrifying, unexplained sounds. We never slept, waiting for the first rays of daylight to break so we could make our escape. Shortly after sunrise, the noises ceased entirely. Finally, we ventured down to the water's edge, looking for footprints or any other evidence of what could have caused all those bizarre sounds. There we discovered one puzzling thing: a large tree trunk from a fallen tree that appeared to have been stabbed or shredded with no natural patterns or signs of wildlife. It was as though the tree had been repeatedly stabbed and gouged with a very large knife, leaving deep gashes and splinters. These cuts were fresh, and they definitely hadn't been there the previous day. In the stark light of day, we left that eerie place without any idea of what had caused those bizarre sounds in the woods. Perhaps there was a reason why they had closed down that campground. Even years later, it still baffles me. I've been unable to rationalize or explain it away. It was something very, I'll just say, unnatural. I've spent most of my life in East Tennessee, surrounded by the tales of old wives and urban legends about the eerie creatures that roamed the dense forest. As a child, I dismissed these stories as mere attempts to scare us away from venturing into the wilderness, believing they were concocted to keep us safe from ravines and getting lost in the vast wilderness. However, the tales lingered in my mind, and as I grew older, my curiosity got the better of me. I started to delve into these stories in my spare time, drawn to the enigmatic creatures said to inhabit these woods. While the locals were fixated on the legend of Bigfoot, I found myself intrigued by the Dogman, although I kept this fascination unofficial. After high school, my sole ambition was to become a park ranger, a job that would allow me to immerse myself in the beauty of nature, even when it was at its most perilous. There are countless stories I could recount, but one that haunts me to this day involves a group of hikers from a couple of years ago. It was early October, a time I typically made my annual pilgrimage to Clingman's Dome. The view from the top, with trees ablaze in a kaleidoscope of autumnal colors, always reaffirmed my career choice as a park ranger. On that particular day, I was on patrol when a distress call came in, directing me to the cabins near Fontana Lake. A woman met me there, her eyes filled with worry. She explained that her husband, son, and brother-in-law had gone fishing at the lake and had not returned. I gathered the necessary information about their descriptions, names, and the details of their truck and boat before setting out to search for them. She mentioned they were heading up to Wolf Creek. I informed the station and then proceeded to drive down to Flat Branch, suspecting they might have ventured into the river there. The journey was lengthy, but getting anywhere deep in the backwoods of the Smoky Mountains always was. Upon arrival, I spotted 3 trucks parked on the side of the road, 2 of them with empty boat trailers. One of the trucks matched the description given by the wife, giving me a starting point for my search. I approached the water's edge and scanned in both directions, hoping to spot them returning from their fishing expedition, but my hopes went unanswered and there was no sign of them nearby. I found a house and decided to ask the occupants if they had seen the missing trio. The man there mentioned he had been fishing himself the previous day and recalled seeing a boat resembling the one I described, with 2 men and a boy aboard, heading west. I inquired if he had a boat to transport me to Wolf Creek, to which he hesitantly agreed, his demeanor shifting from friendly to wary. He consented to ferry me across the river, but refused to take me all the way to Wolf Creek. I accepted his offer, and after a quick dash back to my truck for my backpack, he transported me across the river and promptly departed. It was approximately a mile to the remote campsite I believed they had used. I began walking along the river's edge, keeping a vigilant eye out for any signs of them. It wasn't long before I spotted a boat resting on the shore, appearing to match the description. Approaching the boat cautiously, I hoped to find the missing party calmly sitting by a campfire, ready to head home. But my optimism quickly waned when I reached their campsite. There were only 2 tents, both of them ravaged as if some force had torn into them. I ventured inside each tent, discovering scattered sleeping bags and camping equipment strewn about, trying my best not to disturb the scene. However, it was the second tent that revealed a more disturbing truth. Inside the disheveled tent, I noticed conspicuous droplets of red. Nearby lay a notebook, and I gingerly picked it up to peruse its pages. October 3rd, we set out for our annual fishing trip this morning, much to Mom's chagrin, but we reassured her that we'd be back the following day. The drive to the boat launch was long, filled with our anticipation of the bountiful fish we'd catch and stories of the region. Dad tried to spook me with tales of a cryptid living in the area, but I dismissed it as a jest. We reached the boat launch and embarked on the water without much trouble, except for Uncle Roger's near tumble while trying to release the boat. He didn't find it nearly as amusing as Dad and I did. As we ventured further into the lake and cast our lines, Uncle Roger seemed to relax, especially after a few beers. Laughter echoed from our boat as we enjoyed ourselves. Although we caught a couple of small fish that required release, we finally hit the jackpot when we reached Wolf Creek. Uncle Roger managed to catch 3 largemouth bass, and I caught 2. Dad had a colossal one on his line, but it eluded our grasp. With dusk approaching, Dad suggested we head to one of the secluded campsites. We moored the boat by the shore, securing it to a massive tree. We unpacked our gear, pitched our tents, and Dad lit a campfire while Uncle Roger cleaned the fish. We relished our meal and exchanged stories late into the night. Dad mentioned a promising fishing spot further west, planning to visit it early the next morning before we returned to our cabin. In the middle of the night, I awoke to a strange commotion outside the tent. Dad was absent, and I could hear rustling and what seemed like something pawing the ground and snorting. I surmised it was Dad playing a prank, trying to frighten me. I had dismissed their attempts to scare me with cryptid tales earlier, confident I wouldn't be deceived again. I resisted the urge to turn on the light or investigate, knowing my father and uncle would probably run away, pretending to be the very creature they had warned me about. I anticipated that come morning, they would discuss the eerie sounds they claimed to have heard to perpetuate their prank. Instead, I rolled over and attempted to return to sleep, but Dad's antics continued relentlessly. He stomped around and growled, attempting to gain my attention, but I remained steadfast in my determination not to be fooled. When morning arrived, I ventured outside the tent, expecting to find the campsite intact and my father and uncle with cheerful expressions, ready to break their prank. To my astonishment, the campsite lay in ruin. Uncle Roger asked if I had heard any noises during the night, and I feigned compliance, claiming I had heard something like a creature outside our tent but was too fearful to investigate. He pretended to search for Dad, displaying genuine concern. I remained patient, expecting my father to end the charade, but as the morning progressed, my anxiety grew. Dad was nowhere to be found, and Uncle Roger eventually suggested we begin searching for him. By noon, we decided to set out in search of Dad, with Uncle Roger acting as though Dad had simply gotten lost in the wilderness. I wanted to reveal that I hadn't fallen for their ruse, but I couldn't bring myself to spoil their fun. Uncle Roger was deeply troubled, yet he concealed his emotions, asserting that Dad was likely already back at the campsite. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, we abandoned our search and returned to the camp. Twice, we lost our way, and each time we retraced our steps to reach the campsite. The region had few established trails, and it was evident that people had not explored these parts extensively. Upon our return to the campsite, I rushed to our tent in the hope of finding my father there. However, my search yielded no results. We hastily consumed our meager supper and retired for the night, with Uncle Roger vowing to wake me when Dad returned. October 4th. Uncle Roger never woke me. Dad did not return. I suggested we seek help, but Uncle Roger revealed that Dad was the only one with a phone. We debated our next course of action when we suddenly heard rustling in the woods and the birds fell silent. We scanned our surroundings and discovered the source of the disturbance. A creature was approaching us. It stood tall on its hind legs, producing loud, bone-cracking sounds as it moved. This monstrous being was massive, and I was paralyzed with fear. Uncle Roger urgently pulled me behind the tent, and we tried to conceal ourselves. However, the creature spotted us and unleashed a deafening roar. We were mere feet away, and I could see blood on its claws and teeth, sending shivers down my spine. What? What should we do? I whispered. Uncle Roger raised a finger to his lips, and the creature turned its attention to our tent as though searching for something. Come on, Uncle Roger whispered. We silently slipped away from the monster. We descended the creek's bank and walked downstream, concealed by the water. We hoped the rushing water would muffle any sound and help us evade our pursuer. Time dragged on as we made our way downstream, our nerves on edge. We reached a bridge, a small wooden structure that spanned the creek. Our options were limited, and we sought refuge under the bridge, praying that the creature would lose our scent and leave. We huddled together in the shadows, the daylight fading into dusk and the temperature dropping rapidly. Without our jackets, we shivered, the cold air contrasting with the adrenaline coursing through our veins. As I began to doze off, Uncle Roger nudged me. I looked up, and he motioned for me to remain silent. I was about to ask why when I heard a creaking sound on the bridge directly above us. It was not the steady rhythm of a hiker passing by, but a slow, deliberate progression, as if someone or something were stalking us. I listened intently as each board groaned under the weight of whatever was creeping above. My teeth chattered in fear, and I bit my tongue to stifle the noise. The creature seemed to pause as though it had heard something, its movements tentative as it assessed the situation. We strained our ears, and I heard sniffs, a creature trying to detect our scent. For the first time, I noticed a slight breeze, and it occurred to me that it might carry our scent downstream or upstream. Another slow footstep sounded, causing the board to creak, and for a brief moment it appeared the creature was moving away from us, heading to the far end of the bridge. Hope surged within me, but it was short-lived. The creature abruptly stopped and, with a quick, jerking motion, dipped its head under the bridge and peered into our hiding spot. We remained frozen, our hearts racing as the monstrous creature, on its hind legs resembling a nightmarish dog, scrutinized the area beneath the bridge. Darkness enveloped us, offering precious little cover. The creature's gaze shifted toward us, and our hearts pounded in our chests. Daylight had dwindled to dusk, and our hideout provided some shadows that rendered us nearly invisible. However, our safety was short-lived as the creature approached. My mind locked in terror, unsure of what course to take. Running would likely expose our location, and it appeared our only option was to face a horrific demise. At that moment, I felt Uncle Roger lean closer. He was right in front of me, and I saw him pick up a stone the size of his fist. I realized he intended to shield me, offering himself as a sacrifice to protect me. Tears streamed down my face at the thought of my father falling victim to this monstrous creature. As I braced myself for the inevitable, I saw the creature's terrible claws inch closer to Uncle Roger's face. It was a defining moment. Suddenly, the creature halted, raising its head to sniff the air. The hair on its back bristled, and then, in an instant, it vanished. Uncle Roger cautiously stood, and I tried to do the same, though my legs felt weak. I unintentionally dislodged some stones, creating a minor noise that prompted Uncle Roger to hiss at me. We stood in silence, waiting for the creature to spring from its hiding place at any moment. After several agonizing minutes, we dared to move away cautiously. We descended the creek's bank and walked downstream through the water. "Where are we going?" I whispered. "There's a bridge downstream," Uncle Roger whispered back. "If we're quiet enough and the creature loses our scent, we can hide under it and hope it goes away." I focused on walking as silently as possible in the rushing water, its noise masking our movements. It felt like an eternity before we reached the bridge, a small wooden structure spanning the creek, providing hikers with passage over it. There was little cover. We sought the deepest shadows at the far end of the bridge, our hearts pounding. Time seemed to slow as I sat on the uncomfortable rocks, trembling. Neither of us had our jackets, and the temperature had plummeted as the sun disappeared. I was nearly dozing off when Uncle Roger nudged me. I looked up, and he motioned for me to remain silent. I was about to ask why when I heard a creaking sound. Someone or something was slowly approaching on the bridge above us. It wasn't the steady gait of a hiker on the trail. It was a cautious, deliberate step, as though the entity were stalking us. I listened intently as each board groaned under the weight of whatever was inching closer, one slow, deliberate step at a time. My teeth chattered with fear as I fought to keep quiet. It couldn't have been very loud, and Uncle Roger barely heard it, but he motioned for me to stop. I bit my tongue, trying to suppress any noise, and continued to listen. There was nothing to hear. The creature above us had halted its advance, as if it were listening to ascertain whether it had detected something. I strained my ears, desperate for any sign of movement. Then I heard sniffling. It was the creature attempting to pick up our scent. For the first time, I realized a slight breeze blowing aligned with the water's flow. However, I had no way of determining which side of the bridge the creature was on, and the wind could either save or doom us. Another deliberate footstep sounded like an explosion as the board groaned beneath the weight. For a brief moment, it seemed like the creature was moving away toward the far end of the bridge. Hope flickered within me as another step followed, and then another. I silently sighed with relief as I heard it step off the bridge and onto the trail. However, my relief was short-lived as I saw a face peer around the corner, gazing under the bridge. It was the creature, a monstrous, dog-like being standing on its hind legs, its presence a grotesque nightmare. Daylight had faded to dusk, and there was minimal illumination. Our only advantage lay in the shadows, making us nearly invisible, yet the creature approached steadily, and I feared our safety was slipping away. My mind raced with thoughts, and I felt paralyzed. Running would only reveal our presence more quickly, and it seemed we had no choice but to face a dreadful end. In that moment, I was certain of what had befallen my father. Tears streamed down my face as I imagined him torn apart by this monstrous entity. As I braced myself for the end, I felt Uncle Roger lean closer. He was right in front of me, and I watched as he picked up a stone roughly the size of his fist. I understood his intention to protect me at the cost of his own life. Tears flowed more intensely, obscuring my vision. The creature's claws drew closer to Uncle Roger's face. Again, this was it. Then, abruptly, it stopped. It lifted its head and sniffed the air, its back bristling. In an instant, it vanished again. It was like we were in a terrifying loop. Uncle Roger and I slowly stood, and I tried to follow suit, although my legs felt unsteady. We remained still, listening for any signs of the creature emerging from its hiding place. After several agonizing minutes, Uncle Roger led the way back to our camp. We believed that changing into dry clothes and resting were our best options. The warmth of the campfire and the dry clothes offered a welcome respite from the cold and dampness. I nestled into my sleeping bag and wrote this message, hoping that someone would find it if we didn't survive. I prayed that my father had been as fortunate as we were. I read through the entire message, my heart heavy with concern for the boy, his uncle, and the fate of the father. If my suspicions were correct, the situation was dire. Despite the impending danger, I felt compelled to search for them. I began with a meticulous examination of the tracks around the camp, specifically those near the tents. It seemed that the boy and his uncle had initially headed toward the creek, and the creature's tracks followed suit. I followed the erratic tracks, occasionally losing them, but eventually picking up drops of blood that confirmed their direction. Their dren. The tracks ran along the creek, and I noticed that the boy and his uncle must have returned to the campsite after initially leaving. However, there were no signs that the father had come back with them. As I circled the campsite, I made a disturbing discovery. An adult's tracks led from one of the tents to the edge of the woods and stopped abruptly. There was a dark stain on the tree bark a few feet up, likely from a late-night bathroom break. However, the tracks never returned, as though the person had vanished. I searched the area thoroughly but found no indication of the father's whereabouts. Finally, I realized there were specks of blood higher up on the tree bark. I expanded my search and found tracks of the creature accompanied by drops of blood. My heart sank at the implication. I followed the trail of the creature, hoping against hope that my instincts were wrong. However, each step deepened my dread. I attempted to radio to report the situation, but inexplicably, all I received was static. Frustration and urgency gripped me as I realized that communication had been compromised. I adjusted my backpack, ensuring my sidearm was loaded, and ventured deeper into the cave. The deafening sound of the rain outside gave way to an eerie silence within the cavern. Each step I took echoed in the vast darkness. As I crept deeper, I felt a sense of foreboding that intensified with each passing moment. Two thoughts weighed heavily on my mind. Firing my gun in this confined space would likely deafen me, and the putrid stench that pervaded the cave was nauseating. My flashlight pierced the darkness, revealing the cave's expanse, a rough, uneven floor scattered with boulders and stones. The walls were rugged, devoid of any ancient cave drawings. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps, my breathing, and my racing heartbeat. The tension was unbearable, and I pressed forward with trepidation, every step feeling like a descent into a nightmarish abyss. Doubts filled my mind, and I contemplated retreating, but a nagging sense of responsibility compelled me to continue. As I ventured deeper into the cave, the rain's distant roar outside diminished, replaced by an eerie stillness. I could hear my own footsteps, my rapid breathing, and the pounding of my heart echoing through the cavern. Just as I contemplated retreating, a movement ahead caught my eye. It was substantial, as large as a person. Panic surged within me, and I instinctively pressed myself against the cave wall, forgetting momentarily that my flashlight remained on, betraying my position. I heard a shuffling sound growing closer, and I frantically pointed my flashlight in the creature's direction, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew that I needed to gather more information, but I couldn't afford to be taken by surprise. I withdrew my sidearm, clutching it tightly as I cautiously advanced, my light illuminating the cave's interior. And then I saw it. The creature, a nightmarish amalgamation of a dog-like form, elongated and standing on its hind legs. It loomed only a few steps away, its grotesque appearance etched into my memory. Fear surged through me, but I couldn't afford to hesitate. My only option was to confront the abomination that stood before me. Standing between life and death in the darkest depths of the cave, the creature, a nightmarish and wounded beast, recoiled from the blinding light of my flashlight and emitted a guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Panic surged within me, and I fought to control my trembling body, fearing I might lose control of my bodily functions in sheer terror. Instinctively, I raised my gun and pulled the trigger, unleashing a deafening blast that left my ears ringing. The creature roared in response, its proximity to me making the sound almost inaudible over the ringing in my ears, and it darted deeper into the cave, its malevolent intent palpable. As the echoes of the gunshot faded, I stumbled, struggling to regain my balance and composure. My desperate need to find the missing hiker compelled me to press on despite the overwhelming dread that coursed through me. I scanned the cave floor, searching for any sign of blood or injury, but there was none to be found. It seemed that my shot had merely startled the creature. The realization that it was still at full strength filled me with dread. for I knew that it would perceive me as an invader in its domain. With my flashlight cutting through the darkness, I ventured deeper into the cave, my senses on high alert, watching for any sudden movement. I had no clue where the creature had disappeared to, nor whether it was preparing an ambush. A sudden gust of air brushed against my skin, and I reacted on pure instinct, leaping backward just in time to evade the deadly swipe of claws through the air. My heart raced as I rolled and fired my gun blindly, the flashlight casting a feeble glow on my target. I squeezed the trigger repeatedly, desperate to hit the creature, but it dodged every shot, retreating with unnatural speed until it vanished from sight, leaving me to hope that at least one of my shots had connected. I ejected the spent magazine from my gun, replacing it with a fresh one, all the while chastising myself for not conserving my limited ammunition. In my mind, I reasoned that there was no use in dying with a full magazine. Following the trail of blood drops left by the wounded creature, I proceeded deeper into the cave. A pervasive chill permeated the air, making me shudder as I pressed forward, a sense of impending doom weighing on my mind. It felt like a tomb, my tomb, but I shook off such thoughts and continued my pursuit until the blood trail came to an abrupt end. I illuminated a small puddle with my flashlight, scrutinizing the ground for any clues. The absence of blood beyond that point filled me with unease, as if I had walked into a trap. I scanned every inch of the cave, from floor to ceiling, but the creature remained elusive. My instincts screamed that it was a trap. With my heart pounding, I started backing out of the cave, my eyes darting around, scanning for any sign of my relentless pursuer. Then it struck me like a speeding bulldozer, a sudden, brutal impact to my back that sent me sprawling. My flashlight landed several feet away, and I had no idea where my gun had ended up. Gasping for breath, I struggled to move, but my body refused to cooperate. The creature circled around me, growling and bristling, a palpable menace. I knew it was closing in for the kill. Panic gripped me as I willed my body to move. I watched as my arm slowly reached out toward the distant flashlight. Just as I grasped it, I saw the creature crouch, ready to lunge. I clicked the flashlight to strobe mode, directing its blinding beam at the creature's face. It screamed and swiped at the light as if trying to fend it off. Summoning every ounce of strength, I rose to my knees, keeping the light trained on the creature. When it turned away, I frantically scanned for my gun. It lay a few yards away, and I attempted to crawl toward it, ignoring the pain from my freshly broken nose. Aware that my life hung in the balance, I couldn't afford to feel the pain. I reached for the gun, and just as the creature charged at me with renewed aggression, I aimed and fired. The impact sent the creature tumbling, but it remained on its feet, growling defiantly. My magazine emptied, I fumbled to reload, berating myself for not being more cautious with my limited ammunition. I justified it with the thought that there was no point in preserving bullets if I didn't survive. I resumed my pursuit, exhilarated by a trail of fresh blood drops that indicated I had wounded the creature. Though the drops were infrequent, I knew that at the speed it was moving, it must have suffered a severe injury. As I continued into the depths of the cave, an eerie chill gnawed at my resolve. It felt like a tomb, and the thought of it being my own tomb gnawed at my mind, but I pushed through, following the blood trail until it vanished. My flashlight revealed a small puddle, the final traces of blood, and the absence of any more tracks filled me with dread. I knew it was a trap. My instinct screamed at me. In a desperate retreat, I backed out of the cave, my eyes darting in all directions. Then, out of nowhere, it struck with the force of a freight train, ramming into my back. I sprawled on the floor, my flashlight a few feet away. Gasping for air, I lay defenseless as the creature circled me, its growls growing more menacing. I could feel its intent to kill. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused to cooperate. The creature's breath, visible in the dim light, signaled that my time was running out. With a Herculean effort, my arm was the first to regain mobility. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight. The creature paused just as I got a grip on it. I directed the strobe at its face again, and it howled, clawing at the blinding light. Summoning all my strength, I rose to my knees, keeping the light trained on the creature. When it turned away, I frantically searched for my gun, which I found a few yards away. I attempted to run for it, but my body's full recovery remained elusive, and I fell flat on my face. Ignoring the pain of my broken nose once more, I crawled toward the gun with every ounce of energy within me. It seemed like an eternity until I grasped the grip and aimed it at the creature, which was charging at me full speed. I squeezed the trigger at the perfect moment, sending it crashing down with a horrific scream. It writhed and clawed at its face, blood pouring from its numerous wounds, but even in agony, it refused to surrender. Minutes passed, and it finally ceased its frenzied movements, becoming eerily still. My flashlight revealed that I had struck its eye, leaving nothing but a bloody hole. I dared not approach it, standing at a safe distance, gun at the ready in case it made a final move. Its squeals devolved into moans, and then a heavy sigh before it lay still. With caution, I directed the flashlight toward the creature, cautiously optimistic that the threat had ended. Remembering my original purpose, I tried to regain my bearings and ventured further into the cave. My primary thoughts were finding the missing hikers alive and hoping there weren't more of these creatures lurking in the shadows, for I knew I couldn't endure another confrontation like the one I had just faced. I retraced my steps through the cave, passing the blood-stained battleground where I had faced the creature. Shell casings and blood were scattered on the cave floor, serving as grim reminders of our encounter. I wondered how I had avoided getting hit by a stray bullet, and I looked to the spot where the creature had fallen, but to my bewilderment, it was gone. I searched the area frantically, scanning for any sign of its presence, but it had vanished without a trace. Fear coursed through me as I checked my gun, realizing I had only 2 rounds remaining. The creature's absence was unnerving. It could be lurking anywhere, biding its time for a final strike. Despite the unsettling turn of events, I knew there was nothing more I could do. I was defenseless. Carrying a corpse on my back, I holstered my gun and continued, leaving the creature's whereabouts a terrifying mystery. As I neared the cave's exit, the world outside had transformed. Daylight struggled to penetrate the thick fog that now blanketed the valley. The mist obscured everything below except for the distant peaks of the mountains, which remained untouched by the suffocating haze. I glanced over at my backpack, left waiting patiently for my return, and retrieved my water bottle. I took a moment to savor the last sip, knowing I would need every ounce of energy to complete my grim journey. Sitting on the precipice of the cave, I looked down at the valley below, pondering how to descend with my burden without risking both our lives. For a fleeting moment, the temptation to toss the hiker's body down crossed my mind, but I quickly dismissed it as an undignified option. Rummaging through my backpack, I found a set of bungee cords and used them to secure the body to my back, forming a mob backpack. It wasn't an ideal solution, but it was the best I could manage under the circumstances. With the gruesome load secured, I began the treacherous descent, my heart pounding with each precarious step. There were moments when I lost my footing and nearly tumbled to my death, but my determination to honor my mission and the hiker's memory spurred me on. Finally, I reached the bottom unscathed, but a new challenge loomed ahead. The thick fog obscured my surroundings, and I had no clear path to follow. I decided to move straight ahead, hoping that the fog would lift as I ventured further. The rain had transformed the forest into a soggy marshland, with the soft ground and swollen streams posing additional obstacles. At times I waded through knee water, the cold seeping through my clothes and draining my energy. With each step, my thoughts oscillated between the missing hiker and the relentless creature that had pursued me. I hadn't discovered any other remains in the cave, suggesting that the creature hadn't had the opportunity to bring its other victims there. There, my relentless pursuit had forced it to retreat prematurely. Throughout the journey, I kept my ears attuned for any signs of the creature following me, but the eerie silence of the forest raised concerns. Wildlife often fell silent in the presence of a predator, and I couldn't shake the feeling that danger still lurked nearby. Nevertheless, I couldn't afford to dwell on my fears. My sole focus was to make it back to the safety of my truck, my primary goal to honor the hiker's memory and provide his family with closure. Exhaustion gwed at my every step, and two thoughts persisted in my mind: the whereabouts of the other hikers and the relentless pursuit of the creature. The cave had revealed no other remains, suggesting that they might still be alive. If that were the case, they were counting on me to find them. My journey seemed endless, and I pushed forward with the determination born of desperation. The relentless pursuit by the wounded creature loomed over me like a dark cloud, my constant companion in this eerie silence. After what felt like an eternity, I reached a turning point, a fleeting glimmer of hope on the horizon. I heard the faint sound of running water, the soothing flow of a creek. Hope surged within me, momentarily eclipsing the fear that had gripped me for so long. But hope was short-lived, for I heard a solitary footstep behind me, and I whirled around, my macabre burden nearly unbalancing me. The thick fog obscured my view, and I strained to see through the mist, my heart pounding, my senses sharpened, and I knew I was being pursued. My pursuer was relentless, determined, and a harbinger of death. The boy had given voice to my darkest fears, and I knew I couldn't afford to slow down or become an easy target. With renewed determination, I set my course toward the sound of the creek, my every step guided by the instinct for survival. The marshy terrain slowed my progress, and the cold water sapped my strength, but the specter of the pursuing creature pushed me forward. As I reached the banks of Wolf Creek, I knew my strength was waning. The creature had entered the water behind me and was steadily gaining ground. The creek grew deeper, forcing me to swim, the frigid water sapping my energy further. My relentless pursuer was a mere few yards behind me, and I knew my chances of survival were slim. It was impossible to see whether the creature could swim, but I couldn't afford to turn and find out. With every ounce of energy, I swam to the far side of the lake, praying for salvation. I reached the shore utterly exhausted and chilled to the bone, and lay there expecting the creature to descend upon me at any moment. To my astonishment, I looked back and saw the creature standing on the far shore, unable or unwilling to cross the water. It was grotesque, its single eye socket oozing gore, internal organs visible through its many wounds, and its right leg wounded, causing a severe limp. The rage burning in its remaining eye was unmistakable, but it seemed unable to pursue me further. A wry smile played across my lips as I lay there catching my breath. It appeared that the creature couldn't swim, and for the moment I had eluded its clutches. As I slowly rose and continued my journey back to the truck, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief mixed with exhaustion. I had survived the relentless pursuit, but I knew my battle with the creature was far from over. Upon reaching my truck, I opened the door and knocked gently on the cabin door. When the woman inside saw me, her expression shifted from fear to relief. "Are you all right?" she asked in a trembling voice. I hung my head warily. "No, but I will be after some much-needed rest. I have unfortunate news. I found your husband, but your son and brother-in-law are still missing." A man and a young boy emerged from the cabin, their eyes filled with curiosity and apprehension. The man looked at me quizzically. "Who are you?" he asked. "She's the ranger who came looking for all three of you," the woman explained. "I don't understand," I replied, my fatigue evident. "Your tracks were confusing. I followed them to the bridge, but they doubled back to the campsite." The boy chimed in, explaining how they had rested and then slipped away to a boat rowing across the river to escape. I couldn't help but smile at their resourcefulness, relieved that they had survived. "I'm very glad you did," I said sincerely, pulling them both into a grateful hug. As the boy's eyes welled up with tears, he asked, "You said you found my dad?" My face grew somber as I nodded. "I did, but it was too late." "So he's..." the boy began. I nodded again, my heart heavy. "Where is he?" he asked, his voice trembling. "He's in my truck, but you don't want to see him like that." Before I could utter another word, he sprinted to the truck and peered inside, finding the passenger's seat empty. He turned to the bed of the truck and, upon seeing his father's lifeless form, broke into sobs, sliding down the side of the vehicle. "I'm so sorry," I murmured, turning to the grieving family. The woman embraced me tightly, expressing her gratitude. "Don't be," she said. "Without you, we might have lived in false hope for weeks, months, or even years. You've given us a chance for closure and the opportunity to properly grieve." Tears welled in my eyes as I gently placed the hiker's body on their couch, covering him with a blanket. The boy, still overwhelmed by grief, sat in a nearby chair, his gaze fixed on the covered form. Knowing I had done all I could, I excused myself and left the cabin, my mind heavy with the weight of the day's events. I had fulfilled my duty, but I couldn't shake the feeling of impending danger from the relentless creature. As I drove back home, I called the ranger station and reported the harrowing ordeal in detail, informing them that I would be taking the following day off. After a long shower and collapsing into bed, I had only one thought on my mind: a return to Wolf Creek, armed with more firepower to put an end to the creature that had haunted my nightmares. But that, as they say, is another story.